Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Basstravaganza Gompers attack. Boy, you never know, they can come out of anywhere. So this episode's not going to be about bass fishing again. It's going to be about fly fishing for trout. Just because I'm often critical of provincial fish policies, provincial hatchery policies, doesn't mean that I'm automatically opposed to it and I want to shut it down. Just the opposite. I didn't have a clue that there were any bass in BC until 1971 when I drove across the border for the first time from Alberta. Back in those days, they used to promote the bass fishery on the back of the provincial highway map along with trout and salmon. But I've been reading about the world famous rainbow trout fisheries in the BC interior since I was a little kid, and I still love to get out on those lakes, even if I might make a fool of myself doing it. If anyone's followed any of my previous Basstravaganza episodes, you'll know that I've always been driving around in an old Volvo 240. Always a station wagon in the past, but more recently this sedan because I want to celebrate its reliability.
Not many people have ever seen that number turn over on their odometer, 987654.
But I've been through a number of them, and I maintain a little collection of historic artifacts that have traveled with me for many a weary mile through multiple different Volvos. This little Virgin Mary came from a used Volvo I bought over 20 years ago while I was a student in Victoria. When I bought that car, she was facing backwards, but when I upgraded to a newer Volvo, I brought her along for the ride. But I turned her around so she can see where we're going. I don't need her help to protect me from where I've been. I need her to protect me from where I'm going. As you can see, lately she's taken up fishing. These little toy trucks have been with me for over 15 years. They were given to me by friends. And this little glove came from the little old lady who sold me another old Volvo. And this pathetic little pile of bleached out stalks and stems is actually sagebrush. It became a tradition in my life to make a trip to the mainland every spring and check out some of the wonderful rainbow trout fisheries along Highway 3. Somewhere between Headley and Karamias, you cross into the habitat of that sweet-smelling sagebrush. And every year I'd pull over as soon as I got to that sage and pick a few sprigs and toss them up on my dashboard. I always keep a little bit of sage up on my dashboard for the last 15 years. I love that smell, and it always reminds me of interior trout fishing. And by the way, the trout there are almost all hatchery frankenfish, but I love chasing after them. But now with the COVID, I haven't been off Van Isle for 2 years. So not only did I not get to go out trout fishing, I never got to replenish my stash of sage. And it's getting pretty bleached out and decrepit, along with my fly fishing skills. How I miss the sweet smell of sage and the enjoyment of drifting around on those interior trout lakes. So I shot a lot of video over 5 or 6 years. In those days, every trip was supposed to become a new Basstravaganza episode. But now I realize that will never happen, along with so many fantasy episodes from my old steelhead and bass fishing and other stored video. I'll never get around to publishing it. So I want to condense most of the trout fishing into one episode here, while it could have been developed into 5. This episode won't be about my skills as a trout fisherman. There are 1,000 better TV shows about that subject than I could ever produce, any more than my bass episodes were about that idiot Humpty Dumpling's skills as a bass fisherman. They're about the enjoyment and enlightenment I got just from getting out on those lakes and trying to fool those beauty trout into biting. This is dawn at Vassou Lake along the Okanagan River. Not known as a great trout lake, although there are a few nice rainbows around the lake outlet sometimes. But I love to hang out with the bighorn sheep. You can see them up on top the ridge, checking me out. You know that you're in the interior when you see the bighorns show up. Continuing on up Highway 97, you come to Oliver, where you can buy a Slurpee at the 7-Eleven, turn away from the river and head straight up the mountain. If it's late at night, you might even share the road with a little owl. And before your Slurpee is even half melted, you arrive at Sawmill Lake. To me, this is a wonderful example of how public money can be invested to create a superb recreational trout fishery where there was naught but sagebrush and desert before. There was always a natural depression here, but it shriveled up in summer and became way too shallow for a trout to survive there. So some enterprising folks got together and got some cash from the government and acquired the water rights to the little trickle that runs through there and built a little rock dam to raise the water level a little bit. So nowadays there's a stable lake with extensive, shallow, weedy flats and a deep 40-foot hole where fish can hang out in the heat of summer. But it was still not able to support trout, even hatchery fish, because the whole lake would ice over in winter and all the fish in it would die from lack of oxygen. So they got some more grant money and built a power line from the valley below up to the lake and installed aerators into the lake so it no longer freezes over and the trout can survive all winter. So now we have a small lake, just a big pond really, that provides an astounding rainbow trout fishery in the middle of the desert, only a few minutes from downtown Oliver. There are also free waterfront campsites all around the lake. Sometimes I would even chase the dawnbite after trophy smallmouth and largemouth bass in a Suyus or Vasu lake. And then when it got hot, I'd run up the mountain to Sawmill for the bug hatches in the middle of the day that trigger the big trout into a feeding frenzy. During this particular season, I was a cripple because I fell off my car and I was on crutches for a long time. When I started getting to be able to walk around again without crutches, I hung out at Sawmill for a few days with the turtles. There's a lot more than just big trout here. This water provides habitat for swarms of other critters, bugs and birds and amphibians and even reptiles. These are the increasingly rare indigenous western painted turtles which are getting pushed out over much of their native habitat because idiot kids throw their store-bought pet turtles into the nearest lake when they get bored of looking after them, and they take over. It was fun to hang out with these wild turtles for a while until my leg felt better. Here's a little turtle out for a tour around the lake just like me. Come aboard the stealth bomber, partner, and say howdy to the fans of the Basstravaganza. I like having reptiles around. There are so few of them in BC, outside of politics, and this little guy would not be here if it weren't for the public funding that makes this place happen. And there are countless hordes of chironomids here. They're tiny little worms that live in the mud on the bottom of the lake until they hatch out and turn into flying little bugs that look like mosquitoes, but aren't. Chiros don't bite, but the little trout sure love to bite on the chiros. And there are world-class trout fishers who come to this little lake from all over BC and all over the world maybe to catch the big trout that are stuffing themselves full of chironomids. Many of them love to tie their own flies, way more than they can ever use, and they love to give their flies away. I was watching the chiro fishermen here the previous summer, and I'd met a Japanese guy who gave me some chiro flies, so I was stoked to try chironomid fishing the next spring. It's like being a kid again with a bobber and a worm. But the bobber is just a teeny weeny piece of fluff. And instead of a worm, you use a fly so tiny that I need magnifying glasses even to tie it on my leader. So the idea is that you go out and drop anchor on a good spot and wait for a fish to come along and bite on your fly. It sounds really simple and it looks really easy when you watch all the other people here catching one big trout after another. And you're allowed to fish with 2 rods. So I planned this out all winter, and next spring I went back out to Sawmill with those chironomid flies, and I dropped anchor and I set 2 rods out fishing. But it ended badly for me. At first it was glassy calm, and then a little gust came along and my boat spun around on the anchor line, and within seconds both fly lines twirled around the anchor line, and I had all 3 lines snarled hopelessly together around my propeller. good one. On a chironomid? Yeah. No, I tried a chironomid yesterday. Well, I fished with a chironomid yesterday for the first time. So much for chironomid fishing. I was furious watching everybody else catching fish while I looked like a moron. So I learned one lesson that morning. Humpty's tip of the day. When you go out chironomid fishing, always use 2 anchors and set your boat up in between them so you won't spin around and tangle your fly lines. Humpty's tip of the day. I was so furious with myself for being an idiot that I went racing back to my campsite. All I could do was cut the mess loose and come up with another plan. There were lots of other fishermen on the water that I had to pass on the way. Now, my little electric pontoon boat is a rocket ship the way I have it set up with the motor on the back end. It goes really fast, but unfortunately, I couldn't see where I was going. So I was trying to dodge between the other anchored boats when I did an awful thing. Sadly to say, one of the boats I was racing past, thinking it was anchored for chironomids, was actually trolling a fly behind it. And I was so mad at myself at that moment that I raced right over his fly line and caught it in my propeller and ripped his fly right off his line. I wanted to crawl in a hole and die, but you can't do that out on a lake. So I had to endure the scorn of all the expert fly fishers who were watching the fiasco. And the shame of it all was so traumatic for me that I swore off chironomid fishing. I'm too impatient. I have to keep moving. If I don't catch a bite within a minute, I got to go somewhere else. I didn't get a bite, so another 5 years, maybe I'll try chironomid again. There's another kind of fishing that's popular here too. You tie a floating fly behind a sinking line and drag it along behind. Here you can see me out on the lake a little later, dragging my Gompers along behind the stealth bomber. I still call them Gompers because that's what I thought people were calling them. I Googled for that word, and the only thing I could Google up that sounded like that was Samuel L. Gompers, the famous union leader and the head of the American Federation of Labor. It turns out I was wrong. The fly is actually called a Gompers, which is a genus of dragonflies. So the fly is tied to match the look of the Gompers nymph, not the labor leader, which is good because I don't think a trout would ever bite on a fly that looks like him. But I didn't know any better at that time, and I got in the habit of calling them Gompers, and I still call them Gompers today. So just watching this old video again reminds me of how much I miss this place and how much I hope to get back there again next year. The fly rod I'm using is a decent rod, an old Fenwick, but it's a size 9 that I bought for bass fishing. It's way too stiff and powerful for these fish. I may be using a Medill steel spar for a rod, but my leader is only 4-pound test, so I have to be careful. And it takes a while to ease even a medium-sized fish like this into my net. Medium size for me. There are fishers on this lake who would scoff at a dinker like this one, but for me it's medium size. So you have to take your time. There's no rush. It's a beautiful morn out on the lake, so there's no reason to hurry. If you try to rush them into the net, they'll just break off your leader. One thing I love about Sawmill, in addition to being only 15 minutes from the local 7-Eleven, is that you can set out all your stuff on a picnic table right beside the lake and make a campfire and boil up a hot mug of vitamin C and just sit there and watch the lake and listen to the music from your car stereo. And I always used to bring a book along to read while I sip coffee and watch the trout rise. It's been so long ago that I'd forgotten the book I had along with me on this trip. I really like this book, even if it isn't very popular with other humans. But at least it has one fan. I didn't know that insects could read. Gompers are not the only kind of dragonfly the trout will eat. I've always been fascinated by bugs. I used to collect butterflies as a kid, but I never paid much attention to dragonflies. They're an ancient life form going way back to before the era of the dinosaurs, which is even back before I was born. And during their heyday, some of them were gigantic, with wingspans almost a meter across. It's a good thing they decided to scale down. Imagine trying to cast a fly with a wingspan of a meter. They live underwater for a long time as juveniles. We call them nymphs. And they're ferocious underwater predators that will even chase down and eat small fish. Then they crawl up on land and their skin splits open like a science fiction movie, and they crawl out of their old skin, sprout wings, and fly away. I'm waiting for that to happen to me someday. That would be so cool. This is a slightly smaller version, a damselfly. When they stop flying, damselflies fold their wings over their back. Dragonflies hold them out flat, away from their body. But the basic concept is the same, though. Today, the damsel nymphs are crawling up out of the lake by the thousands. I want to learn more about the different kinds. There are brown damsels and others that are bright blue. And today, the brown ones are everywhere along shore. When they molt into the flying adult model, they're helpless for a little while, until the wings harden and they're able to fly. So they're really vulnerable to predators. You can see the empty shells of the nymphs still clinging to the plant stalks after the living adults have molted and flown away. You can see the brown ones crawling up out of the lake onto the stalks of the riparian plants, and watch the blue ones already flying around. Soon they'll all be out on the lake, probably harvesting the same chironomids that the trout are gorging on. And if the damsels get a little careless, the trout will gobble them up too. You can see this one has just crawled out of the lake and split out of its old skin. But the new skin and wings are not ready for prime time yet. It's like epoxy. It takes a little while for it to set up and get strong. You can see them crawling around on my boat. Some insects will do anything to get on camera. When the nymphs emerge out of the water, they'll grab onto anything dry, including my pontoon. Their bodies are changing fast, and they don't have any time to wait or consider other options. Here's a blue one and a brown one together. I think they might be doing something obscene, and I hope I don't get kicked off YouTube for publishing this. Let's move on. You can see them hanging out here in hordes. Looks like it's setting up to be a bad day for flying chironomids. When you look at all these bugs and realize that they've been living underwater the past few years, you can get a feeling for why they're such an important food source for fish, and why the trout get so big here so fast. You can see the Gompers fly here. The fly is made out of deer hair, which is hollow, so it floats. And the fly line sinks and drags the fly down near the bottom. So if you do the right thing, the line drags through the weeds where the Gompers hang out, and your fly skates along right behind, floating just above the weeds. One thing I like about Sawmill is that you don't have to go far from your campfire to catch nice fish. I remember one fine morning when I was alone on the lake, and I opened all the car doors and blasted this Kronos quartet music while I went out with the camera running and caught a nice rainbow on the Gompers, while the Kronos music melted out across the water. So many memories here, but I can't seem to locate that particular video file anymore, so I'll try to make it up again here. Right. Let's head back out and start dragging that Gompers fly around again.
This is a bigger one.
Sometimes you can feel them nip at your fly, but they don't hook up. And this one came right back and nipped at it again. And this time she got the hook in her mouth. Fish on. You can see that I'm right out in front of the luxurious Volvo Hotel. How's that for fishing close to home? You gotta love it when you can hook into a nice fish and still enjoy the aroma of your campfire drifting across the water. Another advantage of using flippers is that you can maintain control of your boat without ever taking your hands off the rod. I lost a number of good fish because I had to use my left hand to fiddle with the motor control. That allows slack in your line, and slack allows trout to spit the hook out. You can see that this is a good solid fish. You can see another trout rising in the background. When the bite is on, there are swirls all over the lake, but I like fishing early in the morning. You don't catch as many fish per hour as you do later in the day, but I love being the only boat on the lake. I'm gradually getting it closer to the boat. This is a typical sawmill fish, silver and deep and fat. They eat well here. They get caught and released over and over, and every time they're bigger and fatter than the time before. You can see that the other campers have not even woke up yet. But once you're a bass fisherman, you can never turn back. The dawn bite gets into your blood. I've got to be very careful about all that loose line around my feet. One tangle and that fish is history, along with my Gompers fly. You can see that this fish is putting a good steady bend into that big Fenwick. Well, that's what it was built for, not for sitting around on the wall and looking pretty. This could go on for a while. And I'm thinking about holding onto the rod with one hand and speeding in to put another pot of coffee on my campfire. I've owned this old rod for so long, but other than a few steelhead, this is one of the bigger rainbows I've ever had on the other end of it. And this is by no means a big fish for this tiny lake. It holds astounding huge trout, and lots of them. At times it seems like you could dip a huge scoop into the lake and it would come up half filled with trout and the other half with water. I wonder if Samuel L. Gompers was a fly fisherman. I wonder if he ever fished with dragon nymphs. You can see that I finally have the fly line pulled aboard. I'm making progress. Now I just have to strip in the leader and swim this nice rainbow into the net. Easier said than done. This is a critical time with no margin for error. This is when a lot of big fish will break off if you're not careful. But I am very careful because I want to show this nice sawmill rainbow off to YouTube. In the bag. I love Sawmill Lake. In my world, a fish like that is worth getting out on the water early for. And besides, the songs from the birds are always sweeter just after dawn. This fish may be nothing special for Sawmill Lake, but here on Van Isle it would be special for most fly fishers. It does not seem to want to leave the security of the net. Like some other movie stars, it just loves all the camera time it can get. Thanks for the challenge, lady, but hey, this is my show. Go get your own YouTube channel if you want more airtime. But let me thank you for making this guest appearance. Well, that was a nice way to start the day.
A shout out to the great labor leader Samuel L. Gompers. Should have had a fly named after him, but didn't.
I think I'll head back to my campfire and boil up another steaming thermos of vitamin C. COVID is not the only thing raging this world. It seems that this whole part of BC is now just one long raging forest fire all summer long. And the whole concept of sitting around a campfire after mid-April is probably out of the question. This was one of my favorite spots ever to sit around a fire and just look out over the lake. And as Ken Nordine used to say, watch the colors as they get into one another. This is another pretty little lake I explored right next to Highway 5A north of Princeton. That was a good fish, but I missed it. As the day warms up, the bugs start to hatch and the trout start to feed on them. And as the sun rises up over the mountains, it's time to start shedding layers. There are a number of great trout lakes along this route, some of them right beside the highway, like this one. It's called Round Lake because it's round. You don't have to be an expert to catch fish with this Gompers method, and you don't have to use a magnifying glass to tie your fly on the line either. And there are always lots of fish to catch here because the lake is right beside the highway and it's easy to restock. It's like using a broomstick to fish for these smaller trout. They barely even put a bend in that big rod. And I can hardly even tell if I have a fish on the line. But it's a beautiful morn, and it's better than sitting at home watching TV. There are a number of small lakes in this valley connected by a little creek. Even before global warming and global clear-cutting, it must have been hard for trout to find enough flowing water here to spawn. So the hatchery program fills that gap. I was learning a lot here about how to use my stealth bomber pontoon for this kind of fishing. It's certainly not ideal, but it gives me an idea about what kind of changes I need to make. The most important thing for me to worry about is snagging the fly line on an oarlock or on one of the motor mount handles. And also that I need to wear flippers and drag my feet through the water when I'm fishing, because the boat's way too shifty and out of control without any drag or anchor. Then lift your feet up out of the water if you want to go into rocket ship mode. I'm testing out a new plan here. Instead of using a net, I'm trying to release the fish with pliers without touching the fish. But I found that it's hard to do without having the fish flop around and brush against the boat. So you'd want to splash some water over your pontoon first to avoid having the fish's body touch the dry canvas. That would rub the slime off the fish's body, and that slime is the fish's defense against disease and parasites. The gompers are hiding in those shallow weeds, and the trout are in there after them. So anytime you try to skate a fly with a hook on it through this kind of zone, you're bound to snag a weed sooner or later. And it's often hard to tell the difference between weed and fish, especially with this huge rod. This one's a weed, but with this huge derrick of a rod, it's hard to tell the difference. When you snag up, you have to go back and unsnag. This is where it's handy to have the speed and maneuverability of the stealth bomber. You can go back, retrieve your fly, and get back out trolling again really quick. Well, I think it's time to shed another layer. My outer layer splits open and I shed it, just like the gompers I'm trying to imitate with my fly. But after it's done, they can fly and I can't. And that doesn't seem fair. On the other hand, once they fly away, they get eaten by swallows, and I don't. A lot of these interior trout lakes have reeds and weeds growing around shore, and I like to drag my gompers fly along the outside edge of the weed beds. Again, this little fish can barely put a bend in my giant rod, but you can't let the line go slack or the fish will spit out the hook. And there's another nice hatchery rainbow with a taste for gompers, brought to you courtesy of the taxpayers of BC. I didn't hook into any really big fish in this lake, but what the heck, it's a beautiful morn and a great day to be on the water. I wouldn't doubt that there are a few big fatties out there somewhere, but this isn't the kind of lake like Sawmill that produces loads of huge rainbows year after year, the way the sawmills around here produce 2x4s. Well, you get the idea of Round Lake. It's round and it has lots of fish. And some of them even bite for a fisher with minimal trout fishing skills like I possess. Now let's head back to Sawmill Lake and back to my old stash of memories. Lucky for me, even though my brain is losing focus and my memory is getting a bit cloudy, the video I shot back then is still clear and true. At Round Lake, like most places in BC, you're allowed to fish with 2 rods, and you're allowed to use spin fishing gear. So let's head back to Sawmill again. As I mentioned previously, it's fly fishing only here and strictly catch and release. It costs the BC taxpayers a lot of money and effort to create and maintain this world-class recreational fishery. And the quality of the fishery would suffer big time if people were allowed to fish with lures like spinners and spoons and plugs. And the older giant trophy class rainbows would quickly disappear if people were allowed to troll spoons across the lake and load their coolers full of them. However, at Sawmill, you're allowed to fish with 2 fly rods, so I decided to try that plan just to gain experience. And I'm hoping it will end better than my first attempt to fish with 2 rods with chironomids from a boat hanging off a single anchor line. So I'm learning on the job here, my favorite kind of learning. And I have a fly rod set into a homemade rod holder dragging Gompers flies right off the side of the boat. And you can see that I've already attached a second fly reel and second fly line onto a cheap spinning rod. And I'm trolling another Gompers off the left side of the boat. Theoretically, you have twice as much chance of getting a bite if you have 2 rods in the water. But in the real world, you quickly find out that fishing with 2 rods is much more complicated than fishing with just 1, especially if you're fishing in shallow, weedy areas. You have twice as much chance of getting your fly fouled with weeds. And if you ever do hook up with a good fish, you have to deal with the issue of having it swim around and tangle in your second line. After my nasty experience fishing with 2 chironomid rods, I quickly decided to go back to just 1 rod. I didn't want to be forced into a position where I'd swear off using Gompers for another 5 years. Here's another nice rainbow on the Gompers. This little ultralight spin rod allows the fish to fight a little bit more than that giant Fenwick fly rod of mine. And this little rainbow is showing off his stuff. Her stuff, to be more accurate. Because all these hatchery fish are females. Somehow they mess with the fish's genes in the hatchery and turn all the males into females. That way they can't reproduce in the wild, which is a good thing in my opinion. And the genes that make her grow eggs inside her belly are also turned off. So all that energy that would have gone into creating eggs is now diverted into growing meat. And the fish grow huge and fat really fast. Not as fat as me though. Line management is critical in this world of fly fishing. After years in the making, my entire armada is highly customized for filming and topwater bass fishing. As a spin fisherman, my line was wrapped tight around the reel as soon as I turned the handle. But with a fly rod, it slops around all over the place. And the moment it happens to snag around any obstacle like my toe or the handle of my motor, the fish will snap that tiny leader like sewing thread. So it's a real challenge to keep the loose line from tangling and getting snagged on something around my feet. As a bass fisherman, I could leave my thermos of coffee and sometimes even a delicious donut sitting right on the floorboard at my feet. But you can see that fly fishing requires a clean floor. No retention, no triple hooks, and no donuts allowed on this lake. You have to deal with the fish first, then you can deal with the donut after, if you choose. Still, even if I must wait a few minutes for the delicious ecstasy of my donut, it's still a great way to spend a lovely spring morn. And I thank the government of this province for making it happen. Remember, this place would be an alkali pit with no fish and no campers if it were not for the efforts and continuous funding provided by the taxpayers. It's such a radical difference between the sizzling heat and the crowded strip malls only a few kilometers away, and I love coming up here whenever I'm in the Okanagan, fish or no fish. And I like it even better when I'm hooked up to a nice fat silver rainbow. If you look in the background, you can occasionally see big fish rising. It must take thousands of chironomid and mosquito larvae to produce a 5-pound trout. And I'm all in favor of using these beauty fish to help control the swarms of bugs instead of DDT. You have to be very patient with them when they're using these fine leaders, but you can't let the pressure off for 1 second or they'll spit out that barbless hook. If I had a second fly line trailing around out there, I might be in big trouble. But little by little, I'm convincing her to listen to the voice of reason and pose for a brief guest appearance on the Basstravaganza. You can see that the net I'm using might look like a little bit of overkill, but remember that this net is multi-purpose. It's also the same net I use to handle lunker bass and also this fish's bigger, wilder cousins at Fabulous N2 Lake and other places. And not only that, there are rainbows in this little lake that would pretty much fill up this giant net. You just have to figure out how to catch them. Well, I'll take that over another day of sitting around home watching the next edition of the COVID Daily News. These old videos bring back so many memories for me. I miss it so much now that it's been 2 long years since I was able to get out there. I was learning myself how to fly fish at the same time I was learning myself how to shoot fishing video. And even though I did not make much progress at either of those directions, I did make a little, and I loved doing it. Even the disasters, even running over that poor guy's fly line so long ago, it made me a better person for doing it, even if it cost him a fly and a leader. And I sure look forward to getting back to Sawmill again. These videos are from so long ago, and back then every trip was planned to be another Basstravaganza episode. It's so hard to condense it all into one short movie. So let's unscrew the lid on that old thermos and have a quick shot of vitamin C and head back out to look for another one. You have to hold on to that rod every second, because there's no telling when a big fat rainbow might suck in the tiny fly you're dragging along behind. So I'll just let a little bit of line out and bingo, another fatty. That's why you have to hold on to your rod while you're sipping from your thermos. You can see that I'm experimenting again with using the motor to hold the line tight while I try to get the fish under control. Again, having flippers in the water would be much better. Bass fishing is fast and furious, more like a knife fight in a phone booth. But these trout like to run, and my pontoon is like a leaf on the water, with only the prop under the surface. With the electric motor, I can let line out fast and speed away to get set up to start fishing again in a hurry. But I can see that for the actual fishing part, you're way better to use flippers. This kind of fishing is not about speed and power. It's about slowing down and being precise and under control. And as you can probably hear from this video, these electric trolling motors make a lot of noise, and that must scare off a lot of the bigger fish too. You don't notice the noise so much when you're sitting in the boat, but when you have a GoPro on a mount connected directly to the frame, it sounds like a milliarder dragging in a big turn. So I need to make some modifications to my ancient old stealth bomber. But I'll think about that after I get this fish reeled in. One of the wonderful things about recreational fishing is that a few hours on the lake will give you inspiration for countless hours at home in the future, studying the lake in Google Earth, modifying your boat for the task at hand, tying new flies that are better than the boring crap you can buy in the store. And if I studied the lake and studied the kind of bugs that live in it, someday I might even get to the point where I could tie better flies than anybody else has figured out how to produce. Another chunky sawmill rainbow. For me, this is a nice medium-sized trout for this lake, but for a lot of fishers here who are more skilled at this kind of business, this would still be a small trout in their world. I don't care. For me, this little clip brings back so many memories from that day and other days on this tiny little piece of water. And it gives me motivation to get back there someday and chase after some of the really big fish that live there. So when I do shoot video, I've learned that my style is just to turn the camera on and let it run and wait for something to happen. I don't have a guy behind me hired to run that camera. And back in these old days, I had not even yet invented my swivel mount for the GoPro, which lets me lay the camera down beside me on the left pontoon when it's not running. Then I can turn it on with my left hand and flip the swivel up, and the camera is quickly shooting video and pointing in the right direction, while I deal with the rod and the fish with the right hand. Back then, my GoPro was mounted on a plastic pole, and I had to turn the camera on in my lap and then reach back and fit the pipe into its holder. Then I had to hang on to that fish while I reset the camera angle. As you can see here, it wasn't easy. Imagine trying to do this with a big fish on the other end of your rod. You can see a lot of slack line hanging out here while I try to fit that mount in place. It's amazing that that fish did not spit the fly right out and swim away laughing at what an idiot I was. Another reason for developing a new mount was when I got excited after hooking a little trout at Cump Lake. This is pathetic. They don't even know the name of their own road around here. This is another pretty little lake and campground along Highway 5A. Well, here's the way to Cump Lake. I've never been here. Look at this. It's a monument to a Volvo 240. Is that cool or what? Huh? I hooked into a nice rainbow on a Gompers and accidentally grabbed the camera pole instead of the net. Oh, that water's so cool. And I watched myself stick a running GoPro under the water without its waterproof mounting, thinking I was netting a trout.
I can't believe this camera still works. It just got dunked underwater.
Way to go, GoPro. That was one of the reasons that I developed a new improved swivel mount for my camera. Now I don't have to deal with all this chaos. Now we can get down to business. Well, this is a much better fish. This is why I come back to Sawmill when there are so many other lakes around with trout in them. This is a world-class rainbow trout fishery only 3 kilometers from the 7-Eleven as the crow flies. Actually, after a crow has eaten a Slurpee, it will probably be too fat to fly anywhere for a while. But I don't have time to ponder that question because I have a beauty Sawmill rainbow to deal with. Again, you can see that I'm using a fly reel and line attached to a little ultralight spinning rod. Not ideal for a bigger fish like this. She can sure put a steady bend into it. If that fly line loops around an oarlock, that fish is history. At certain times during a mayfly hatch here, I've watched humongous trout slipping along shore right in front of my campfire, sucking mayflies off the surface in half-meter deep water. Someday I'd like to film that from underwater. Another thing I've learned about bigger rainbows, whether they're interior fish on the fly or steelhead on Van Isle, is that they always seem to run towards the sun. I want to get around to the other side so I can film with the sun at my back, but she just will not let you do that. The moment you get close to getting between her and the sun, she immediately runs towards it, and I can't stop her. She doesn't want to be anywhere except right in the glare of the sun's reflection, and I can't move her. This is where it would be good to have a second boat with a real cameraman filming who could run around to the other side. Again, I'm using fly gear on a tiny spinning rod. It doesn't do these magnificent fish justice, like there would be fighting them on a longer rod, even that big 9-weight Fenwick. You can see that all the while she will not move from her position between me and the sun. This is a good solid fish. They don't seem to jump much here, but they sure pull hard and long. There's no lake like it here on Van Isle when it comes to big fish in a little lake. Not to mention that it's within Slurpee range of the local 7-Eleven. When the chironomid bite is on, there will be many other boats on the water. And at times you'll see big fish, 3 kilograms, 4, even larger, cruising in 1 to 2 meters of water, searching those weeds for the Gompers. This is when even nearly clueless idiots like myself can stick some trophy-class slugs. Little by little, I have to inch her back up to the stealth bomber while her agent negotiates with my lawyer about her contract for being a guest star on the Basstravaganza. Well, I guess that says it all. Her agent could not come to terms with my lawyer, and she canceled her guest appearance. It's not the first time that's happened to me. Well, let's go out and try this again. Same lake, another day.
As you can see, I don't have a clue what I'm doing with a fly rod. Oh, he's still on though. He's coming right over towards you.
This could be a crowded lake when the bite is on, and sometimes you have a problem with your fish peeling off line and getting tangled in the line from another boat. Like right now. This fish is truly threatening to run all the way out to the boat you can see in the distance. And there ain't nothing I can do to stop it with my flimsy 4-pound leader. I remember reading about this kind of fishing when I was a little kid growing up near Chicago. It's one of the reasons I live in BC now and not back there. Someday it would be nice to do battle with a really big sawmill rainbow with an old split cane bamboo rod, just to know what it feels like. But when a novice like me can hook up into fish like these, you can only imagine what lurks here for fishers who are light years ahead of me in tackle and technique. The really good fishers here don't have to troll around. They cast these Gompers flies and even those tiny little chironomids out of a drifting boat maneuvering around with flippers. There's so much to learn. I once met a guy here who told me that one fine day back in the days of yore, when the Gompers were hatching out big time, he had caught and released more than 50 rainbows over 5 pounds each in one day, and the biggest was over 13, all on Gompers. If most anyone else had told me a story like that, I'd assume they were BSing, but I have little doubt that he was telling the truth about that day. Just like me, he misses those days of yore. This fish has caught up to me, and now it's passing me. This is my favorite kind of fishing education, on-the-job training. You can learn about the same concepts just by watching it on some TV show, but that's not the same as feeling the fish pull line off your reel with the swallow swirling around over your head. They're probably chasing the same Gompers as the trout, and me. Everything likes to eat them. Here's a picture of a smallmouth bass I caught on a fly rod and Gompers some years ago at Spider Lake here on Van Isle. And I remember being out on Trout Lake in Northern California one afternoon when it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the westerly wind was howling and it was impossible to hold my position against it. So I ducked into a little cove surrounded by reeds with giant dragonflies hatching all around. The largemouth bass there, which you would more often target with a rubber worm, were going bonkers, leaping out of the water to grab the Gompers out of the sky. I could throw a buzzbait straight up into the wind, and by the time it hit the water, it would be 50 meters downwind. And I would get a hit on every cast, if it hit the water at all. Sometimes the bass would leap right up out of the water and grab my lure out of the sky before it even hit the lake. And if they shook the lure loose before I could reel them in, another bass would grab it before I could reel it into the boat. A once-in-a-lifetime Gompers experience. Well, it's getting down to the nitty-gritty. I've got incoming traffic from the other direction. Stealth bomber to tower, requesting permission to land. A big fat rainbow on runway 3. Now I'm getting close to another boat.
Heads up, I got a big fish on here.
Normally I don't like fishing in crowds, but I can deal with it if I'm on a lake with fish like Sawmill, especially if it's only 3 kilometers from a 7-Eleven.
Wow, that's a nice one. That's why I came here. Oh, yeah. That's a nice one.
I've caught and released much bigger fish here than this one, probably double the weight of this one, but not on film, I guess. Can't find it anyway. And this is just an average fish for this lake for the wise guys here who know what they're doing and have the gear to make it happen. On a hot day like this, you want to get that fish unhooked and back into the water fast. No time to pose for the Basstravaganza now because every second counts. Get that hook out quick and clean and send that fish back to that cool water it loves. Thank you, fish, for helping me celebrate a wonderful afternoon on the water. And also a shout out to all the people who had the vision to make it happen and keep it happening.